Hello, this is Evan Rogerson, also known as 9 Motor Gang, and earlier today the Game Manual Update version 2.0 was dropped. This is a major game manual update, so I'm going to go through and break it down. Something differently compared to what I've done last time is I'm kind of going to give my thoughts on how I believe that the rule will affect gameplay. Just because now I've kind of had some experience with playing the game, I think I have some general ideas on how different rules will affect different gameplay strategies. And also, something different that I'm doing is on the right side of my screen, I will have the 2.0 PDF. This is the newer version, this is the legal version, and over on the left side of the screen is the older competition version, just to kind of easily be able to show and highlight the changes that were made. So, disclaimer, after 40 minutes-ish of recording, I realized that it was not set up with the screen share properly. It was only recording half of my screen, so the version 2.0 game manual will be inanimate because I don't feel like going back and recording the entire video up until like 10:20 at night. So I'll still make sure it has all the relevant rules pulled up, but my cursor and stuff won't be moving along to match what I'm actually doing, so apologies for that. If you enjoy this video and find it helpful, please consider leaving a like and a comment on the video, just because that helps the YouTube algorithm, which makes the video do better. Jumping right into it, the first thing that you will notice. So, jumping right into the manual, the very first thing that you'll notice is the field setup has been changed again. So, I believe this is the second time this season it's been changed, and I can't remember any other season at all where the field setup has been changed, so kind of a weird thing. But the corners are now triangles, they're not squares. So as you can see on the right side of the field, there is now a triangle there instead of it being just a square. So the corners are smaller, and they also have some different rules for how a goal is considered scored in the corners, so it's definitely going to shake things up. But overall, it's mostly just the size of the corner is changed. It doesn't actually impact like the point values of the corners or anything else along those lines. So one other part of the setup was changed, and that is how the rings are positioned. Slightly different thing. This was something I pointed out in my last video, and I actually emailed the GDC about this. Never heard a response, but obviously they must have heard it because they changed the field setup. So previously, this is the old field setup. Your positive corner had a red ring on top, regardless of which side you were on. So this, and on your negative corner had the blue ring on top, which wasn't exactly fair because on the corner where you would go for like the third goal, red would have their ring on top, but blue would have their ring on the bottom. So depending on how your robot worked, it could actually be beneficial for you to be on red or blue alliance. It wasn't fair in that regard. But now the field setup has been fixed, so now the opposite color is on top all the time, so it's consistent. This is obviously a massive change, as now you aren't going to need a completely different autonomous routine for the red side rather than the blue side. I know when I spoke to 2775V at Mall of America, their blue side autonomous was worth more points just because it was better optimized for, I guess, the blue setup in going for one of these corners rather than the red setup. So this is going to be a good thing. It's going to make autonomous routines more consistent, and it's going to mean that you're not going to need a different program and have different capabilities depending on whether or not you're playing as red or blue. So, good change in that regard for sure. Another small thing, this isn't really anything that the competitors are going to worry about, but they've now added this diagram recommending where event partners put the field displays. This just wasn't there before. So, field displays are supposed to go by the positive corners, and your head referee is supposed to be by the negative corners, and one scorekeeping referee for each of the positive corners. This isn't a requirement, it's just a recommended locations. Obviously, this is not something that's going to be enforced and like directly affect gameplay, but I think it's good just because of SG11 that you need to have referees by the corners. Additionally, this is also something that I've seen most events do. This is the most typical setup. I believe it was either in the head referee certification course or the event partner certification course. I've done both of those. I believe there was something in there that said you were supposed to do this. It might have been one of the webinars I've gone to as well. But this was already common practice, but just putting it in the game manual is going to be good for those newer event partners who aren't necessarily as well connected, helping to know how to set up the field correctly. So as you can see here, the definition of a corner has been updated. Previously it was a square, now it's a triangle like I said earlier. And additionally, it's also stated to be an infinitely tall three-dimensional space, which is not something that was over here, because it specifically said it is not a three-dimensional volume, which as I get to, I believe it's rule SC4, it describes how a goal is considered scored. That criteria has changed slightly. So it was actually rule SC5. So as you can see, SC5 is significantly larger in our newer game manual compared to the old game manual. They've even added a new diagram. So previously, the mobile goal had to be contacting the corner, and since it was a two-dimensional space, it had to be contacting the floor in there. Now, it just has to be contacting the floor or white tape line anywhere. So it specifically does not have to be contacting the floor within the corner zone. It just still has to be contacting the floor, so you can't have this goal raised off the ground or on top of a ring. It needs to be contacting the floor, but it doesn't need to be contacting the floor in the corner, which is of course incredibly helpful considering the bottom of the mobile goals is a convex surface, so you can be hovering over something but not touching it very, very easily. Now the next part is some portion of the flexible top of the mobile goal stake is higher than the top edge of the field perimeter. This is referring to the barbs. Essentially this just means the goal has to be upright, which was already a thing, except now I think it's worded a little bit clearer because I'll put this picture up on screen of a scrimmage I was at with a technically upright goal that counted in the corner. So I definitely believe that this is a better change, makes the rule more intent with the goal has to be upright. And then finally, the mobile goal has to break the plane of the corner, which if you're familiar with X games, this is something that's happened before. I believe in Tipping Point, this was a big thing, the goal breaking the plane of the neutral zones and the alliance zones. And they don't specifically say that contact with the robot is irrelevant, but I would assume that you still can be touching the goal and it's not going to affect the corner status. The tiebreaker criteria seem to be fairly similar, so it's just whichever one is further in the corner. It's still the same general intent, just reworded slightly to fit the new verbiage. Overall, this isn't a super important thing, as usually it was pretty obvious which goal was in the corner, but they are there if you decide to go and read through those. Scrolling back up to Rule SC3, this is the rule stating whether or not a ring is scored. This has actually changed a lot in ways that I think are going to dramatically affect gameplay. So now, tipped goals, the rings on them still count for points. A ring can be touching the floor and it still counts for points. So what does this mean? Essentially, if you tip over a goal previously, usually the top 5 rings, as you can see in this picture, goal tips over, the bottom ring usually stays scored, the top 5 usually touch the tiles. In the previous version of the games, it would descore all 5 of these top rings, resulting in the goal being worth 8 points to only worth 3, assuming it was one alliance who filled the entire goal. So, usually tipping goals was a great strategy, great thing to do at the end of the game, because it would net you an advantage of 5 points if you could pull it off. I've won matches by doing that. But now, tipping a goal, the rings still count for points. So using tipping goals as an offensive strategy is now bad. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't help you. However, I think tipping goals is now a good thing for you to tip your own goals over as a defensive strategy. Because when the goals are tipped over, they're going to be harder to move around the field, and a tipped over goal cannot count for points in the corner. Which means if you tip over your own goal, it's going to be significantly harder for the other alliance to move it to the negative corner, because they're going to have to somehow flip it back upright and move it across the field, which is going to take significantly more time than it previously would to just grab a goal that's sitting there and move it over to the negative corner. So I think tipping over your own goals, especially if you're going for the third goal, maybe if the other team gets double positive corners and you want to fill up a third goal, but you don't want them to be able to move it to the negative corner at the end, tip it and put it as far away from the negative corners as possible. And there's a good chance they won't be able to move it there with the time that they have left, especially if you're trying to get in their way a little bit. Another thing that I think this affects gameplay a lot is this is actually a small buff to hanging at the end of the match, specifically tier 2 and tier 3 hangs, because part of the definition for being an elevated robot, which you can see here in Rule SC7 Part C, the robot cannot be contacting mobile goals to hang. It is still legal to climb the ladder with a goal, but you aren't technically hanging until you let go of the goal. Previously, and I've done some testing on this, if you drop a goal from about 4 feet in the air, the height of the tower, usually the goal tips over. Like about 85% of the time this goal is going to tip over. But now, if the goal tips over, you don't care. You don't lose your points. So before, if you dropped your goal with 6 rings on it, chances are you would only still have 1 ring scored at the end. But now, all 6 rings are very likely to be scored. There's a small chance that 1 ring will bounce off, but even then, you're still going to get 5 points. So, hanging is now going to be roughly worth 5 more points going for those taller hangs, because if you can climb all the way up to tier 3 without having to worry about leaving your goal on the ground. So, you can climb up there and drop your goal at the end. I think it's going to make hanging a little bit more viable, which is something else that they tried to change with one of the future updates. Now, something that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone who's been following the rule manuals is the autonomous win point was going to be updated in the September 3rd game manual update. This is something they specifically said they would do, and now it's September 3rd. So for those unaware, Worlds qualifying events will now have a different autonomous win point criteria. So this is Event Region Championships, Signature events, Showcase events, and almost all VexU events will now have to follow this new criteria. So now you must score 4 rings instead of the previous 3 rings. You have to score on 3 stakes instead of the previous 2 stakes. And one of those rings has to be scored on your alliance stake, which does count as one of your 3 stakes. And these stakes have to be on your side of the field. And there is a Q&A about this, which neutral stakes do not count towards the AWP. So, looking back up at the field, you have access to 3 stakes on your side of the field at the start of the match. In order to get the autonomous win point, you will have to put a ring on all of these at a signature event or Worlds qualifying event. There is this other goal, so you could potentially get to 4 stakes, but that's not necessarily going to happen, as there's only going to be, at best, a 50-50 shot you get this goal. And then the autonomous win point has the normal things of you have to leave the starting line and you have to have 1 robot contacting the ladder. So overall, I think this is not going to affect gameplay too much. At a signature event, you should have no problem driving forward and scoring a ring on a mobile goal. And if you're one of the better teams, you shouldn't have any problems also scoring 2 rings on your alliance wall stake or another one on the goal. Scoring a ring on the goal, if you can't do that at a signature event, you shouldn't be at the signature event. The scrimmage I was at earlier this year, this was in July. A middle school team from Kansas was perfectly capable of an autonomous. They coded in 5 minutes, driving back, grabbing the mobile goal, scoring a ring on. So it's definitely something every team can do. It's not a very high ceiling. And at signature events and event region championships, you should be able to expect most teams to be able to do this. So I don't think it's going to have huge impacts for the high school level of play, as long as you can make sure that you yourself are capable of scoring about 3 rings, including on the alliance wall stake, which I know for some robots can be a little bit tricky to do. I think this will have a massive impact on VexU, as the VexU setup is completely different, and it's now very hard to get the autonomous win point because you have to goal rush. So the VexU setup, you only start with 2 stakes on your side of the field, 1 mobile goal and 1 alliance stake. So in order to get that 3rd stake, you're going to have to grab one of these mobile goals off the autonomous line. So for VexU, you now have to goal rush. You can't hide on your side of the field, which personally, that's what I was going to do. It's a lot more consistent, not having to worry about what the other robot's doing to get the autonomous win point. Not something I love, as previously the autonomous win point was something you could get regardless of what your opponent does. But now for VexU, it's dependent on what your opponent does, because if they rush 2 goals, you might be left with only the middle goal, and who knows, maybe they'll have some sort of method to be able to grab both goals before you can do it. So not a huge fan about that. Might Q&A it and see if there's going to be something different for VexU, but considering that most VexU events are going to be Worlds qualifying, I doubt anything will change. SG2 was clearly too small of a rule. As you can see, it was only about 2 1/4 pages long. They decided that it needed an extra paragraph, as you can see, note 2, that was not there before. So this comes from a Q&A from WPI that pointed out a weird exploit. Vertical expansion does not rotate with the robot, however horizontal expansion does, which means that you could actually rotate your robot, and now your horizontal expansion would be facing vertically, and you could infinitely expand out in one direction. So you could actually make your robot, according to the previous game manual, you could actually expand out to be 12 feet long in one singular direction. It's kind of complicated to think about, but it was a thing. Now they've fixed the glitch by you can't just rotate your robot and not be affected by vertical expansion or horizontal expansion, but it was a funny little thought experiment to have while it lasted. Rule SG3 was updated, small verbiage change, as you can see at the top there. Nothing major, it's still the same rule. I do think it's funny that in my last video I pointed out that the GDC made an oops, and they had the SG3 diagram in the middle of SG4, and now it's right back where it should be at the end of SG3. So, hi GDC member that I know is watching my videos. Thank you for fixing this. Another big rule change, which I think will make wall stakes a lot more viable, is now removing rings from the field. If you remove 3 of your own rings from the field, that is not an instant DQ. it is not illegal to remove your own rings from the field. As you can see before, it was strategically removing rings that leave the field, but now it's just the opponent's rings. So from a technical point of view, it is completely legal to throw your own rings out of the field as much as you want. However, you would likely receive a G3 and an S2 violation for doing this, so I wouldn't recommend it, as well as there being very little strategic reason to want to do that. So now you can freely go onto the wall stakes and try and score your own rings, and if you get bumped, if you miss, because I know that it was very common for teams to go and score on the wall stakes and they would miss and one of their rings would go out of the field, and obviously if you rack up 3 of those, it's going to be an instant DQ. So now you don't have to worry about that anymore, so you can do wall stakes without having to worry about a DQ. Definitely a good change in my opinion. However, you do still have to worry about accidentally dropping a ring outside the field while descoring rings. So overall, I think this makes wall stakes slightly more viable, as now you don't have to worry about the instant DQ, because everyone loves instant DQs. SG6 received a small verbiage change. Originally it said 2 rings and or 1 mobile goal, so you could interpret it as you can only possess 2 rings or a mobile goal. They've fixed that. The or is not anywhere to be found in the new version. Just a small verbiage change does not affect gameplay. SG11 has also received some small changes and a very big change. So the first couple small changes are just some verbiage things. They clarify what is considered in the corner for protection, and how you can't remove rings from goals that are in the corner and score rings on goals that are in the corner. And the big change is SG11 now lasts for 15 seconds as opposed to the previous 10 seconds. So now you have an extra 5 seconds at the end of the match from which you can leave the positive corner, and as the GDC wants you to do, you can now go hang with those extra 5 seconds. It's no longer viable to tip goals. Still, you can move goals to the negative corner, but if they're tipped over, that's going to be a lot harder to do. GDC is definitely trying to incentivize teams to go hang and do wall stakes. One thing I don't like about this is now camping in the positive corner is even more viable, because now you have an extra, combined between your 2 robots, you have an extra 10 seconds to move around. So getting double positive corners is now even more powerful in my opinion. However, wall stakes and hanging are also going to be a little bit more powerful, so maybe that'll help counter some of these double positive corner camping strategies. Additionally, there were some small changes to rules S1, S2, G1, G2, G4, R28, and T1, just to kind of clarify intent. One of the examples I'll touch on is rule R28. This paragraph is new. A team that circumvents a robot rule for a competitive advantage should receive an immediate disqualification for the current match and be reported to the event partner for discussion with the RECF regional support manager, who may recommend the team be disqualified from the event. Violations should also be reported to the RECF Foundation Rules and Conduct Committee following the event. So I think it's just good having a little bit more standardized procedure about, hey, if this team is intentionally cheating, maybe they're modifying their motors, they'll be DQ'd from the match instantly, and then more clear procedures to the public about what's going to happen as they move forward with this procedure. Always think it's good to make these things more public, let the public have a better idea of what's going on. Just because I know this was an issue, I believe there was some teams getting DQ'd at Worlds for this, so I think this is a good thing moving forwards. Now, something that was quite controversial at Mall of America is Rule T10, Part G. The rotation of the mobile goals is not specified. Despite all of the field diagrams showing the mobile goals facing one specific way, technically the resetters could set them up however they wanted. I know a lot of teams missed this. They thought the goals would be set up one way, and then the resetters just didn't care and put the goals however, which definitely disrupted some teams' autonomous. So now, mobile goal rotation is specified to the way that it looked like it always was, but technically wasn't. So overall, good change. It's going to make coding your autonomous a lot easier, as you now know what the rotation of a goal will be. Definitely going to make a big change for just making autonomous easier for teams. A bit of what seemed like a side tangent, something really funny, is high stakes is probably the hardest game for a new team to get into out of any of the recent games. In Over Under, a push bot literally made dome. It was pretty easy to get involved. In high stakes, you could push rings into the low goal with a push bot. Before that tipping point, you could move goals around the field to score points with a push bot. Before that, you had changeup, where a push bot could somewhat de-score occasionally. so they could at least still score points that way. Before that, you had tower takeover. You could push cubes into the corner. Before that, you had turning point. You could push into a flag to score points. But this year, the easiest task is to pick up a ring and score it on a mobile goal, which can be quite challenging for some middle school teams who have never heard of robotics before. As a result, at this tournament in Australia, which had 16 teams, I believe, you had 9 out of, I believe, 32 matches end in a 3-3 tie. As you can see, a lot of 3-3 ties here. So what this meant is that the teams didn't score points in autonomous, so you had an autonomous tie, each team gets 3 points, and then no rings were scored for the entire match, and over a quarter of the qualification matches ended this way. So obviously, this opened up the very real possibility, thankfully it didn't happen, of in a round of 16, you end up with a 3-3 tie. So in eliminations, if a match ends in a tie, you replay the match. But if no robot is capable of scoring points, you're just going to replay the 3-3 match over and over and over and over again. So in order to fix this was brought up in a Q&A, the GDC implemented a special rule. So as long as one ring is scored or one robot hangs, then you will have a repeat, because this is usually just going to be a normal tie. Teams did their best, and it just happened to be a tie. You replayed, it's probably not going to be a tie. However, the GDC acknowledges that some matches, the robots might not be very good. So, if the match ends with no rings scored and no robots elevated, then whoever has more mobile goals on their side of the field, there's 5 mobile goals, so unless a goal just sits on the autonomous line the whole game, you're going to end up with a scenario in which there is 3 goals on one side, 2 goals on the other. Then the team who got 3 goals on their side will win the match. So push bots can play, get your goal on the side of the field if they can't score rings. Now, an interesting scenario is, as you can see here, we did have a couple of 6-6 matches. What I believe this represents is a robot has a preload, and they are only capable of scoring their preload. They can't pick up a ring, but they can score their preload on a stake. So in this case, yes, you do end up in an infinite loop of the teams, because they do score rings, so you get to play a tiebreaker match. The GDC did say in the Q&A that they would have, after a certain number of ties, the higher seed would just advance. However, they haven't actually implemented that for the certain amount, so it's still kind of up in the air about what would happen. So please make sure your robot is capable of scoring more than 1 ring in the entire match. A new addition to robot skills rules has been made. So violations from robot skills matches do not carry over to qualification matches, essentially. So like the 3 rings out of the field and you're instant DQ'd. If those are your opponent's rings that you D-score and knock out of the field in skills, that's not going to count towards your 3-ring penalty for qualifications and eliminations. So good change. Not running skills will not help you not get DQ'd, if that makes sense. Another weird change is Rule RSC3C said that teams may use 1 Red Alliance preload, but now it is teams must use 1 Red Alliance preload. I don't know why this was changed, but now you have to use your preload. Not sure who was not using their preload and why the GDC decided that wasn't okay, but that's a new rule. A brand new rule was added, which states that it is now legal to throw objects out of the field during a robot skills match. It will no longer be a rule violation. You can finally fulfill your dreams of the mobile goal cannon, shooting goals across the field without risk of DQ. Finally, we now have justice. In addition to this, there have been a couple typos that have been fixed. I'm not going to go through and find every single typo. And that's it for this game manual update. Version 2.1 comes out on October 8th. So I know a couple of competitions will have happened before then. I'm going to be judging and potentially running skills in a competition up in Nebraska before then. So definitely get to see these rules in action there. That one's not going to be a major update. I wouldn't expect much to change. These are going to be pretty much the rules that you play with up until January when the next major update comes out. Overall, I don't know how to feel about the update. Nothing that really makes me feel one way or another strongly. Definitely some interesting changes. I think the most interesting one will be the tipped goals still count for points, just from a gameplay perspective. But overall, I don't feel strongly either way. I know a lot of people are upset with this game manual update because they felt like it changed a lot of things mid-season, which it didn't really. And then I know a lot of people were hoping for the autonomous bonus to be lowered from 6 points to 4, which I do get. Autonomous is a lot of points this year's game. I'm not as worried about that, though, because I'm in Vex U, and Vex U is just going to score higher because we have Tier 3 Buddy Hang. So Autonomous is percentage-wise less points. And then another thing that I know people were hoping for is maybe more stake points for the wall stakes. Like I know some people were hoping like maybe the top ring is 3 points, but the other rings are worth 2, just because wall stakes are hard to do. Really, all that they changed there was now you don't have to worry about getting DQ'd, which is a good thing. And I know some people were hoping for negative corners to be buffed, but they weren't. I don't think there is going to be a super huge thing, especially now that you can just tip over your own goal to stop the other team from putting it in. I don't think they'll be used much unless somebody screws up and leaves their goal undefended, which I think you'll see less of. Overall, I think double positive will sort of fix itself out. I know at the scrimmage I was at in semifinals 2, the team got double positive corners, the Red Alliance did, and they still only managed to win the match by 3 points. So I definitely think later in the season, as teams get faster at scoring the wall stakes, double positive will no longer be a guaranteed win. But until teams really get good at the wall stakes or at local events for the rest of the season, double positive definitely seems to be very powerful and very good, as well as the autonomous bonus, because until you start seeing those tier 3 hangs that the GDC really wants you to do, they really want you to do those tier 3 hangs. Until you start seeing those, though, I think double positive and autonomous are pretty much just going to win you. It's going to be very similar to MOA in that regards. But later in the season, definitely by Worlds, I'm sure that you'll definitely see those things being less important. So overall, I think that's everything. If you do have any questions, please leave them as a comment down below, and I hope to see you in the next one.